revolution over about 100, 150 years. And finally, the digital revolution. And the guy is sitting there looking thin, but that didn't last for long with the digital revolution. And that's really when our obesity epidemic started. And to understand what we have to do now, I think it's really helpful to review this. Now, again, our DNA was designed to live in the wild as hunter-gatherers. And they spent a lot of time gathering a big variety of fruits, vegetables, had a lot of fiber, a lot of vitamins. Their diet, because they hunted, was high protein and actually high cholesterol. They loved the organ meats. It also had a lot more omega-3, one of the good fats, compared to the contemporary diet. Now, the hunter-gatherers, as individuals, were really quite healthy. And, this is somebody from the Amazon, from New Guinea, Aborigines from Australia, and, they all sort of have six-pack abs. And the point is, they didn't get it by going to the gym or doing crunches. They did functional exercise, as well as core and interval exercise, but it all came naturally. But they were big and strong, and things changed about 10,000 years ago, after the second ice age, when wheat started growing wild in Mesopotamia, where there was the right soil. And when people are starving, they'll try to eat anything, and they try to eat the seeds of the wheat, but that went right through them. And somebody, I imagine, got the idea of seeing what was inside the wheat seeds. So they ground some of these wheat seeds. That was the first stone ground grain. It was kind of sharp, difficult to eat, so they softened it by putting water on it, and ground seeds, water plus microbes equals fermentation and edible grains. So that was the beginning of eating grains, and then they learned how to cultivate the grains, acres of grain. And while the hunter-gatherers would really kill all the local animals, take all the fruits and vegetables out of an area, and they were nomads. They had to move. They couldn't produce that much energy for the time they spent. With fields of grain, you could produce a lot more energy per acre. And not everybody had to be hunting and gathering and working on food all day. So that was the beginning of extra time, the beginning of our politicians and inventions. And so the first towns and villages grew up. They were not stable towns and villages in the time of the hunter-gatherers, as well as domestication of animals. And following the towns were cities. And really, all of our advances, our research and development, started and were in cities. And at first, the agriculture did not reach all ends of the earth. There was still a lot of hunter-gatherers, but because they didn't have to spend all their time hunting and gathering, they could invent, they could invest, and it's really true to this day. This is how you increase productivity. And so, in this time period, the world population started to increase. And not because the agriculturalists were necessarily healthier than the hunter-gatherers, but they starved less because there was this more consistent source of energy. Now, not everything in the cities was good. With domestication of animals, some non-domesticated animals like rats, poor sanitation. Some of the cities were like big petri dishes, and that was really the birth of infectious disease and things like the Black Plague. And not all of the agriculturists too good. In fact, anthropologists, when they look at the remains, saw evidence of cavities, osteoporosis, vitamin deficiencies. They didn't see that much in hunter-gatherers because they were depending on one source of nutrients, wheat, rice, or corn. And in fact, the agriculturists were shorter than the hunter-gatherer, and really, as individuals, not as healthy. So the question, why did we all become agriculturalists? Well, again, that was because of the consistent source of energy, and also with their spare time, they invented guns and steel and armies, and also the fact that the big populations was the birth of infectious disease and germs. And it really shows that pictures of Spanish coming to the New World, and what killed the native hunter-gatherer Americans, Native Americans more than anything else, more than the guns and steel was really the germs. So we all became agriculturalists. Now there were a few exceptions. You know, it was Genghis Khan who conquered really all of Asia and beyond, and they lived on on horse meat. And they milked the horses and made made cheese and yogurt and dried milk. They didn't travel. They didn't have any grain. And in fact, they were bigger and stronger than the agriculturalists they fought, and which is why they were able to conquer most of the then relatively civilized world. The other group is the Maasai in Africa, who also had a meat and dairy diet, and to this day they're very big and very strong. And let's see if I can. Can you hit the play button from there, or some of you watched Anthony Bourdain.
Yogurt-like drink central to the Maasai diet.
Cheers.
Cheers. And before you say yuck, it might be worth noting that between their nearly 100% protein diet of meat, blood, and dairy, the Maasai are known to have near superhuman cardio, Olympic-level stamina and condition. They can run miles at a time without rest or water, and can basically kick your ass at near any physical contest given half the chance. So help yourself to some sour, lumpy goodness.
Now, many of you watch Anthony Bourdain, so this was his visit to Tanzania and to the Maasai. He also dined on organ meats, and that was really what they loved to eat, with a lot of cholesterol, but also nutrients. And of course, it wasn't 100% protein, but it was very high fat and dairy. And if we jump up to colonial America, where there was a lot of game meat, and they often, if you look at old histories of people visiting colonialists, they had meat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and also a lot of dairy. There was the milkmaid who made the milk, butter, cheese, and yogurt. And here is a colonial recipe: a pound of lard and a stick of butter flavored with an abundant compilation of animal fats, frying in healthy slabs of country ham, and rendered in its old fat, salt. And you'd say, well, boy, this is a recipe for heart disease. The only thing is there was not actually heart disease reported during the colonial period. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we started to run into difficulty. And with manufacturing, a lot of things changed. Presented at the 1873 Vienna World's Fair was the steel roller mill. That was what took the whole grains, not digestible, and took out the bran where the fiber was, the coat, took out the germ in the middle where all the vitamins were, and left you with white flour. And this was important because with better modes of transportation, food storage all of a sudden became important. And the processed grain, as well as being less expensive, cheaper, had a longer shelf life. And that became very important when people were off the farm and not getting fresh food every day. Another thing that happened was Rockefeller making kerosene cheap, and all of a sudden average Americans could light up the night, didn't have to go to sleep. Now, when this was done and followed by Edison, nobody did a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of whether it was good to be up at night reading with light instead of going to sleep. And the point is, all of these changes with technology were unintended experiments that seemed fine at the time, so we just went forward. Now, there are recent studies, this is one of them, that going to sleep reading tablets may not be the best way to get a good night's sleep. And in this study, it actually shows to suppress melatonin, and you are more likely to wake up in the middle of the night. But it's fun, it's good to watch the tube, be in front of the screen, but again, never tested. Now, another thing is, as far as less expensive cooking as well as food storage, was the introduction of trans fats, invented in the 1890s, but introduced first with Crisco margarine in 1909. So for the first time, there was commercial margarine, and again, had very good shelf life, helped preserve other foods, and it was 3 years later, I don't know if this was direct effect, that Dr. James Herrick reported the first case of coronary thrombosis. Now, he was quite disappointed when he made this presentation. He thought it was kind of a big deal, but nobody was that excited. The reason was that people were not seeing heart attacks at that point. Now, if we jump ahead to one of the first world-famous cardiologists, and the cardiologist of Dwight Eisenhower, of course, had early heart attacks. Paul Dudley White wrote one of the early textbooks in cardiology in 1943, and he said that when he graduated from medical school in 1911, he never heard of coronary thrombosis. Well, that's because it wasn't reported until 1912 by Herrick. But he talks about not seeing coronary disease in his early days of practice. By the time he wrote the textbook in 1943, it was already epidemic. And so it was really around the time of World War I that the epidemic of coronary disease started. Now, at that time, we used a lot less butter and a lot more margarine and trans fat. The Crisco was getting very popular, and it was also cheaper than butter. So here was this epidemic of heart disease starting after around World War I, after World War I, and by the 1940s it was there. So what was it? Were we overnourished? Well, when Uncle Sam came to recruit soldiers for World War II, the problem was that they were actually undernourished. And that was the beginning of national guidelines of having a minimum amount of calories for school lunches. And when we did our HOPS program in Florida, somebody complained that the kids weren't getting enough calories. We actually just did the quality of food, not the calories, but those guidelines from the World War II recruits were still in place. Now, the problem now is, of course, the opposite, with obesity becoming a big problem in Army recruits. All right, well then we started the digital revolution over the last 25 years plus, and this really started also at the same time is the national guidelines that said have a lot of bread, rice, prosta, and spare the fats. And we also started more and more sitting over computers. This something called the Yonda syndrome, sitting disease, but it's now called the new smoking when we sit all day at a computer. And this is probably not what Bill Gates had in mind. And even kids, new problems called eye posture. And it's causing all kinds of back pain and neck pain in the young today. And posture is a real problem. We were made to squat and sit, not to slump in chairs. And this is having a lot of ill effects. Now, one thing, in what we call optimal health, we talk about postures with our patients. This is my ergotron. I stand all day, and I never had great posture, but I'm also wearing this little Lumo lift I call the Schlumpometer, and it gives me a little buzz when I go into a bad posture. So that's the Schlumpometer. So what happened with the digital revolution and the national guidelines? And you may have seen this, but it's so dramatic. Starting in 1990, looking at states with no data, less than 10% obesity, and the fattest states in the union had 10 to 14% obesity. By 1991, and this always starts in the Deep South, going through the Midwest, in the poorest states, all of a sudden there was 15 to 19% obesity in Mississippi and Louisiana, and then spreading out at first relatively slowly, but you just see how the country's gotten fatter and fatter. And by the mid-90s, all of a sudden, Deep South up through the Midwest, greater than 20% obesity, and spreading faster all the time. And so by the, and here's Colorado, the thinnest state in the union, but fatter than it was in 1990. And again, now greater than 25% obesity, again in the Deep South going through the middle, and now greater than 30% obesity, again starting in the Deep South. And here's Colorado, still the thinnest state of the union, but by 1990 standards, it would be the fattest state in the union. And you can also appreciate that this is accelerating. So what's going on here? For me, in the 1980s, when the low-fat guidelines came out, I got to taste the Snackwell's Malamar, and it had 0 saturated fat, 0 cholesterol, and I thought I could eat it with impunity. This was my favorite. I did try the other 25 varieties, and they were hard to get. They went off the shelves very quickly, and I found myself getting fatter. But here it really did fit into the guidelines. It was zero fat, and the country we increased our sugar intake, decreased whole grains, increased our whole fructose corn syrup. And so when we were having whole grains, vegetables, fruits, we get a slow postprandial increase in blood sugar, and it drops slowly, and many hours later, you're hungry again. When we switch to white bread and donuts and Coke, we get a higher peak in blood sugar and a bigger trough, reactive hypoglycemia, where we're hungry. And so we're hungry again, we eat more calories than we need, and we begin to store fuel in our bellies. Now, if you go back to the hunter-gatherer and early man, wouldn't it be a survival advantage if during times of famine, or I'm sorry, during times of feast in the summer, fall months, when the fish are jumping and the game is running and there's fruit on the vine, you eat some extra calories. You store it in your belly for the inevitable winter famine. And in fact, what if you were hungrier at this point? So even though you had enough to sustain you, you ate more to build up this storage. And that's what actually happened. This is a survival mechanism where you move to this insulin resistance curve, where you get a higher peak of blood sugar and then a deeper trough where you are starving. This is that late afternoon. When I had it from my Snackwell's diet, I used to make a run for the doctor's lounge and down some low-fat blueberry muffins, which were very good, but it just kept the vicious cycle. And in fact, a good percentage of America are on this blood sugar yo-yo, and it's really, and that's why people, by the way, supersize. Being on this blood sugar roller coaster, it's not a conspiracy of the food companies. It's that when your blood sugar is dropping, you will eat anything, and it takes a while to get the signal that you're full. And one very interesting phenomenon as we export our diets is what we call the Thrifty Gene. And as we said, when you eat more and increase the fat cells in your belly, at some point you switch to this roller coaster sugar curve. And what's interesting is populations that had very subsistence living, like the Pima Indians in the southwestern United States, but you see it in the Middle East, in Dubai and all the Emirates, where they have plenty of money and we're exporting the fast food. You see it in China, and every place we have the fast food, you're getting obesity. But the Pima Indians, where they had this Thrifty Gene, they were living in the desert, having some corn and maize, and anytime there were extra calories, if they could eat more and store the fat, that helped them survive. But once they moved on to reservations in the 1950s and they were given the Western diet, they blew up like balloons. And their pancreas continued year-round to produce extra insulin to overcome the insulin resistance of the tissues until it burnt out, and they're all diabetic, and their kids are diabetic. And the incidence of heart attack and stroke is huge, but it is in all these populations. I mean, there are a few people who don't move to this curve. Those are the people who can eat anything they want. They don't get particularly hungry, and we all hate them. We can say that, well, if it was hundreds of years ago, they probably wouldn't have survived. So this is a survival mechanism gone awry. And actually, we possibly should be absolutely flipping over the food pyramid. Healthy fats, good protein, and a variety of fruits and vegetables, and forget about the processed carbohydrates. And finally, as far as meat and saturated fat, which is controversial, and while, as we'll see, the history of saturated fat, we had it during colonial times. The Maasai, other groups had a lot of saturated fat without coronary disease, but they did not have grain-fed marbled meat. And so this is another unintended experiment, to have the modern, very, very high saturated fat meat. Our ancestors had game meat, which was a lot leaner. They had the high cholesterol organs, and that's how they got a lot of their nutrients. And the meat was lean, and the meat also had the traditional grass-fed, whether it's grass-fed cattle, It has a lot more omega-3 and a lot less omega-6, which is an essential fatty acid, but pro-inflammatory. So grass-fed cattle mimics the game meat and a good ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 and not as much saturated fat. And this is a summary from data from the Harvard School of Public Health study and their professionals health study, where they followed over 100,000 health professionals. And they look here first for substitutions for saturated fat. And if you have trans fats instead of saturated fat, you're going to have increased mortality. If you're doing olive oil, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, omega-3, you improve. Whole grains, you also do better. Refined grains, you don't do better than saturated fat. And here, if we look at substitution of fats, whole grains for refined carbs, again, trans fats is the worst, but saturated fats, anything else for refined carbohydrates, you do better. And the other thing of these unintended experiments, there are many more. One was antibiotics, originally given to animals to prevent epidemics, but they noticed the animals got fatter. And so they started using antibiotics to fatten up the poultry and meat. Well, you know, in the last 20, 30 years, we've been abusing antibiotics. Is that fattening up our kids? We think by changing the microbiome. This is a study from published just a week ago, and won't go through the details, but the more antibiotics kids are on, the fatter they are. And the ones born of C-section who don't get their mother's microbiome by going through the birth canal, also problems. And overall today, you know, going back to the mental stress as well, there's an optimal amount of both physical and mental stress we need. And today, a lot of people, you can do a lot from the couch and from the computer. And, you know, it really bothers me when I see all the advertisements for retiring to the beach. That's not healthy either. Now, on the other end, we're really not sure marathon running and being a triathlete is that good for you. In fact, we're seeing coronary calcium in a lot of marathoners.
Did you just say we're seeing coronary artery calcium in marathoners?
Yes, there's some early studies.
Hear that 'cause you're not close to the mic.
Oh, sorry, yes. And this was, you know, recently, and they're finding this in these high-powered firms where people are working day and night. This was a kid from Goldman Sachs who committed suicide. And the point here is that our increased connectedness with all the screens and all the computers is pushing us really in both directions. Too much stress, trying to get all your exercise in at the end of the day, or too little stress, you can do everything from the couch. And we really have to find that sweet spot. And just quickly to summarize with diet, don't consume trans fat. Totally avoid the processed carbohydrates. Choose good fats, omega-3, fish oil, olive oil. Choose grain-fed meat and poultry. Full-fat dairy, I think, is okay. I think the government does now also, and a variety of fruits and vegetables, but not the concentrated fruit juices. And avoid sitting for long periods of time. It's a disaster. Learn to stand at work or sit on a Swiss ball. Be conscious of posture. Get a good night's sleep. No late night screens. Moderate exercise, like the hunter-gatherer, should be functional core, not doing machines. And finally, learn to relax. Don't be working day and night. We don't have time, but there's a lot of new evidence on mindfulness, on meditation, and we know what to do. We need Tony to go to the doctors and make sure they're telling everybody the right things. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask no questions now, and if we could just allow Dr. Agatston to exit with Cindy Jambroni. She's going to get him to the airport safely.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Art,
So,
don't
get it to
forget
him.
your phone.
So everybody, sorry about the delay for lunch. As soon as we get Dr. Agatston out to the car out front, then we can take a break and have some lunch. We have one speaker that did not, that announced last night at 11:30 that he would not be with us today, and that's the Kaiser stroke doctor. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility in our schedule. I know several speakers have said to me, Dr. Cantor, that they're concerned about flights, etc. So I think we're going to get back on schedule. So I think, Carla, could you say something about lunch, please?